notice when you see the urine of the person who has it. That's how Archibald Garrod got interested in it. It's a little bit hard to say, I had to look it up. And I have a soundbite, but I don't think it'll play on anything. So it's a recessive mutation in the HGD gene. Luckily, it's very rare. About 1 in 250,000 people have it. It's a little bit more common in Slovakian and Puerto Rican descent because there were founding mutations in both those populations. It's also known as black bone disease because it turns the bones black, as we'll see in the symptoms here. It causes black urine from birth, so even infants will have urine that turns black. The actual cause is a buildup of homogenistic acid. It's another one that's hard to say. But that builds up in the body because the genetic mutation prevents the proper breakdown of tyrosine in the body. So there's a multi-step process to break down excess tyrosine and excrete it, but that process stops at homogenistic acid in the body, and that tends to build up in the tissue. So a lot of people that have this disease will have black around their mouths, in their ears. You'll see it in the whites of their eyes. They'll have black spots. And it's really bad for you. Garrod didn't know about a lot of the worst complications that happen later in life. He mainly knew about the coloration of the urine. But it can cause damage to a lot of tissues. It ruins your bone density. It's hard on your heart and the valves in your heart. And it also ends up causing a lot of pain because it damages the cartilage, so everything's rubbing on everything else and not being padded properly. A lot of people who have alkaptonuria end up having to get hip replacements at about age 50. It also causes kidney stones because the acid buildup can end up getting to such a high concentration that it crystallizes in the bladder and causes stones. There were several people whose work helped Garrod reach his conclusion, notably Mendel. Mendel's work came out about 50 years before this, 1866, I guess, yeah, 44 years. But it wasn't popularized until his friend and colleague William Bateson started telling everybody about Mendel's work. Bateson was also the one who came up with the word genetics and the word epistasis. So he popularized Mendel, and it was through him that we got Garrod to notice that. And the other person was William Prout, who was actually the first person to isolate homogenistic acid from alkaptonuria patients. Unfortunately, it looks like Garrod may not have actually known about Prout's work because Prout called this melanic acid in reference to its color, and the name didn't stick. It was called homogenistic acid by Wolkow and Baumann, which are the people that are referenced in the paper as being the first to isolate the acid. So I'm not really sure whether Garrod knew about Prout or not, but it looks like he didn't. Incidentally, Prout also was able to classify the four macronutrients. He classified them as sugars and starches, oily bodies, and albumin. Today we know those as carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So he wasn't very good at naming things and getting the names to stick. So the path to this discovery had two parts to it. The biggest part was Garrod went around and cataloged the families of the people with alkaptonuria. He had already sort of noticed that this was something that happened in families a lot, so he wanted to see what was it about families that ended up causing this disease. There were lots of cousins, first cousins, marrying each other and their children having alkaptonuria in his paper. And Oh, hey, the buttons do work.
Yep.
There's the button I wanted to use. So this is the most important table in the whole paper. It's the one that shows that first cousins are likely to have children with alkaptonuria, while alkaptonuria is extremely rare in people who are not related. So from this and from his conversations with Bateson about Mendelian genetics, he was able to deduce that this is a recessive genetic trait that is carried in families. The other major thing that he talks about in his paper was alternatives of metabolism. And this was something that he ended up building his career on. He saw people as having chemically distinct metabolisms, and this was something that was very, very new at the time. Everybody at the time thought that people look different, but the chemical processes are basically the same, and nobody saw people as having distinct chemical makeups or balances in their body. So unfortunately, he doesn't devote a lot of time to this in the paper. There's one line about a guy named, keep pressing that button, about Franz Mittelbach, which I had a heck of a time finding anything about him. He didn't really make a big name for himself, and he was German. So all of his papers were scanned onto the internet. They're there, but they're scanned rather than transliterated or transcribed, and so you can't use Google Translate to read any of them. So mumble Franz Mittelbach. I did find out that Mittelbach's research involved giving tons and tons of tyrosine to rats and then observing the effects. This was how Garrod knew that the breakdown of tyrosine resulted in homogeneistic acid. So that's how he knew that this was a chemical process that happens within the body, because Mittelbach gave way too much tyrosine to rats, and when he did that, the rats would excrete homogeneistic acid because they couldn't break down all of the tyrosine at once. So their bodies got overloaded, and that's how they knew that this was one of the intermediates in that chemical process. So pulling it all together, there's chemical and genetic variation in different people, and this goes together. That was the big thing that Garrod showed, was that these go together, and this was something that people hadn't really thought of before. And the importance wasn't really noticed until later. It was, the 50s before you had Watson and Crick, where people were aware that it was DNA that was the carrier of genetic information in the body, and that became translated into all of your proteins and chemical processes and how your body works. But he did recognize that genetics and your chemical makeup go together, and he speculates in the paper about how this seems like something that may be common, but often asymptomatic, that people may be different, but that we may not really see the chemical differences because things like diet and lifestyle can change those and obscure the genetic differences, and so you would have a difficulty detecting those at all, and wouldn't be able to find them. He called it like looking for a needle in a haystack. Luckily, we developed tools later on to be able to find all of those. Garrod, after this paper, became quite a distinguished scientist. He was elected to the Royal Society in 1910. After World War I, he was knighted. That was for his service. He was a doctor in the British Army on Malta. He gave the Croonian lectures in 1908, and this included his work on alkaptonuria, albinism, which he also referenced in the paper as something similar in its genetic inheritance, and two other urinary diseases that I don't want to try to pronounce. He wrote a book on pediatrics that was still in print for 40 years. And in 1924, he was one of the first people to advocate that women should be allowed to join the medical schools. Alkaptonuria has had a much slower evolution. The enzyme was found in 1958. The gene was found in 1996, but we still don't have a real cure. This is the pathway all the way from tyrosine and phenylalanine down through homogenistic acid. Yeah, the words are hard. But right here is the gene that is, or the enzyme that's broken by the mutated gene in alkaptonuria patients. This nitransinone is a potential treatment. I'm not really sure if that is actually out yet or if it's just in clinical trials. There were a number of sources talking about analogs of this that were being tested. But the idea of this is to stop the entire breakdown pathway at tyrosine so that instead of an acid buildup, you get a tyrosine buildup. But there's, of course, also some risks associated with that. Notably, tyrosine can affect your corneas. So do you want bone loss or do you want to go blind? I'm not really sure which is the better option. The aftermath for science was very big, though. The direct link between the chemical makeup of the body and genes was something that has become more and more important and more noted as fundamental to science since this paper came out. It started the field of molecular genetics and linking chemistry to genes. And here are my references. Thank you very much for your attention.
So as usual, everyone else gets a chance before I jump in.
Just kind of curious, give a. So I noted in the paper that he covered a huge age range of patients when he was looking at disease. Do you have any thoughts on like how he missed all the other symptoms? I know he was kind of urine focused, but if he saw these people, he would have seen the kidney, some of these other things come up, right?
He did talk a lot about the data of other people who had looked at alkaptonuria. And that was one of the things that he spent a lot of the paper on, was just saying, yes, these other people have found these other cases, but it's uncertain what their data is, because a lot of them at the time just would describe things in prose, but they didn't do any chemical analysis of the urine, so it wasn't sure, is this really the same thing? Is the urine black because of the buildup of acid or something else? And a lot of the doctors at the time would say that this is something that comes and goes, whereas in all the cases that he looked at, this was something that was congenital from birth. So that was what also led to his saying this is something that is fundamentally different in the chemical workings of people's bodies, is that because this is from birth, it's an alternative metabolic process. He called it alternative because he didn't realize it was extremely inferior. He noted it was mildly metabolically less efficient because you lost some energy by not breaking it down. But yeah, he ended up discarding a lot of people's data simply because it wasn't good enough to meet the requirements of conclusively saying this is a Mendelian recessive trait. Yeah?
So the treatment compound, was it nitrazone? What is that?
I'm not exactly sure. Oh, I'm not exactly sure what it looks like, but I know that it inhibits the enzyme that breaks down tyrosine in the initial step right here. So this enzyme is inhibited by the nitrazone.
So then is the buildup of tyrosine not great either?
There haven't been any long-term studies of tyrosine buildup, so it's uncertain what all of those symptoms are, but it is known that it can harm the cornea. So yeah, it's not something that you want to do for no reason, but they're hoping that it's less bad.
Do you know if they looked at the cornea of the rats that they gave all this, excessive tyrosine to? Maybe it's in the German that scanned it.
The cornea bit was actually something more recent. I couldn't read the German, and so the only reason I knew that he gave a lot of tyrosine to rats at all was like one sentence in one of the papers that was talking actually about Garrod's work and the build-up to it. So there wasn't very much about Mittelbach at all.
Information for that. One of the things, again, also particularly about this time, is almost all of the chemical literature was in German, and so German was actually required for all scientific studies. So you actually had to take German because there's so much of the literature was in German. And if you do run across something, this is not so much for you because you're doing a presentation now. If anybody else runs across any German text or anything like that, I can translate at least some of it. I have tried to read all of Gregor Mendel in the original. It's hard work. It's really hard work, but it's doable, and I can help out with stuff for something really particular that you're like, what the heck would this be? And sometimes Google Translate is interesting what it comes up with.
Yeah, the biggest problem with Google Translate is just that a lot of these papers are really old,
right?
And so to get them onto the computers, they just scanned them. They didn't transcribe them. So the text is there in a picture format. Google Translate can't read that at all, so you can't even attempt to figure out what it is. I'm pretty good with Latin roots. I learned Spanish and stuff, but it wasn't enough to get through his papers.
And some of the typography as well is also sort of Old German, which is hard enough to read even if it was a language that you understood.
Yeah.
That's definitely challenging. I also had another couple of quick comments. So one of the things I think is nice that you pointed out that he's using a lot of other people's data. I always call this one of the first examples I know of metadata. And so reanalysis of other people's data. And so I think he did a nice job of that, and really critical. You've got a disease which is so infrequent, then you have to depend on other people's data in order to be able to follow up on it. So it's the reanalysis of other people's data, which I thought was really nice.
That's another good biographical point. Later he was appointed to be the head doctor at, I forget where, but one of the hospitals in London. And the guy before him was very not chemically oriented. He was a very good clinician, but he wasn't about analyzing chemistry of people's urine. Garrod was very critical of people who did not bring science into their study of diseases, because they would write descriptions and they would not cite anything. They wouldn't record anything important to being absolutely sure that their data was correct. So it's one thing to report, oh, I observed this person had Alkaptonuria. It's quite another to say, I distilled the acid out of their urine, tested its melting point, so I'm absolutely sure that this is the same chemical as these other patients.
And that reminds me, did anyone else notice how he was doing the derivations for a lot of this? So the lead salts, it was melting at a certain temperature, and how much lead do you have to use for this, and how much heavy metal poisoning is he dealing with in the process? I'm not sure anyone would be using those kinds of techniques anymore.
We'd at least be using latex gloves nowadays.
At the very least. Now the other question, did you find anywhere in looking at this what people are using now to measure the homogeneity and anything else? They're not using lead salts, of course, but...
No, I didn't find a lot on the chemistry.
Okay, yeah. I think it's HPLC, but I'm not absolutely certain on that, what people are using. And then one of the things here, just looking at this really nice pathway that you found, it strikes me that fumarate's an acid too, and so is the real problem buildup of acid, or is it just the buildup of this particular molecule, the homogeneity?
I didn't find anything specific about that in the literature, but I suspect that one would be easier to get out of the body than the other, because it's not so much that there is homogeneistic acid as that it builds up in your tissues. That's what really causes the problem. So if these other acids are easier to get filtered in the kidneys, then that would prevent the whole problem.
Well, you were saying it tends to crystallize in the kidneys, right?
Yeah, that's when the concentrations are really high, then it can crystallize and cause kidney stones. But it's also building up in the tissues. So even though the kidneys are getting rid of large amounts of it, they're not getting rid of all of it.
Yeah. Isn't the black a oxidation reaction that happens too?
Yeah, the black color in the urine and the bones is actually because the homogeneistic acid oxidizes to something else called alkapton, and that has a black color to it.
So can you maybe go back real quickly to the table, table 4? I don't remember which one that was. The busts. I'm trying to remember which ones it was. I always get confused by these things. Yeah, so this was the cousin study, right?
Yeah, this was comparing in table A people who were offspring of first cousins, and in table B you can see there's a lot fewer patients, and these were people whose parents were not related.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then you can also see here that Garrod's data, which is the third line in the top part. So he's got 2, and then all these other people together. Eventually you get to 12 cases, but mostly other people's data that he's analyzing in this case. So it's really pretty impressive.
It's a very rare condition, so it's hard to find cases, right. Especially then when for something like this, people didn't reflexively go to their doctors, and even if they did, their doctors didn't have places necessarily to report it. So it was very hard to even find people with this.
Did they know the tendency of recessive alleles to build up in marriages of first cousins, or is that something that he...
Well, they did because of Mendel, but Mendel's work was only popularized by Bateson about 2 years before this came out. So around 1900 is when that became popularized. So the scientific community was just becoming aware of this. I'd say the population at large pretty much had no idea.
Because I would guess that this table really depends on you knowing that the 2 first cousins is a significant detail of that, right?
Well, it was something that he noticed that this is in families, and in talking to the families he noticed that hey, a lot of these people are related. So he ended up getting the data for this after sort of noticing that on an anecdotal level. And then saying, well, let's pull the data for this together and look at, is this really something that causes it? That's another thing that kind of made this a landmark paper. Bateson said that, hey, this is following a Mendelian pattern, but he mostly just said that this is something that happens when first cousins marry. And it was Garrod that came along and said it's not just first cousins marrying that causes this, because not all first cousins have alkaptonuria children. He was saying it's only when first cousins of particular chemical makeup mate that you get alkaptonuria.
And didn't they also have one case, or was it a couple of multiple generations that alkaptonuria parents and then offspring?
There were a couple of cases like that. I think an alkaptonuric father who had a son who had it, and there was a family where 2 out of the 3 kids had it, and another family where 3 out of 10 had it. So it wasn't, but when your numbers are that low, the standard deviation means you'll see all kinds of things. So
it's pretty huge.
Luckily, they were still able to figure out what the inheritance pattern was.
And at this time, of course, there was a lot more first cousin marriages, which were happening. So,
Yeah, well, it wasn't a big
they
deal
didn't
then.
know the genetic implications of a first cousin marriage yet.
I feel like I saw a mention in that paper about, him talking about as an ongoing debate about the effects of inbreeding, and he wasn't gonna touch that.
Yeah, one thing that I didn't spend a whole lot of time reading about was, eugenics was something that was kind of on its way up here, and there was some references to Garrod having a letter series with some other scientists about, is this a thing? But no indication of like what his political feelings on that were or anything.
Yeah, all the other thing is at this time, particularly in England, but there's a very rigid class structure. You may watch Downton Abbey or anything like that. So you don't marry within different social classes. It's the same social classes, and these are very often have been related to each other as well. And when we talk about hemophilia later on, is another classic case of inbreeding. So, thanks, Ben.